Yeah,
All
great.
right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, you're on.
Perfect. All right, good morning. My name is Clare Boerigter, and I'm a writer and environmental storyteller. In a past life, I spent 3 seasons working for the Forest Service as a wildland firefighter on a crew based out of Utah. Today, I live in Minneapolis, where I write about fire, climate change, ecology, and more. Today, I'm going to talk about my latest project for the Clare Forestry Center, sharing the ways in which I enliven research through storytelling. Over the last 2 years, I've worked with Eli Sagor, Kyle Gill, and other great folks at the Clare Forestry Center to tell ecological, cultural, and historical stories. 2 years ago, I produced the Camp 8 Stand, a multimedia story map which dives into the history of an old-growth stand of red pines, while underscoring the importance of thoughtfully managing these systems. This year, I've written a historical collection for the CFC, which explores 4 stories from the 1960s to today. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on 2 of those stories which center researchers: the story of Gordy Gullion and his groundbreaking grouse research, and that of Isabel Ahlgren and her dedication to studying the boundary waters. After sharing stories from Gordy and Isabel's lives, I'm going to talk briefly about my storytelling toolbox, including 3 simple techniques that help me shape a compelling narrative from expansive, complex, and research-heavy material. I hope that this toolbox can be applied to your own work and can help you whenever you think about sharing your own research with a broader audience. To make things simpler for me as I present, everything you're going to see is embedded in my PowerPoint. But Gordy and Isabel's stories are available online as story maps within a larger historical collection. You are able to view the entire collection via links in my abstract, as well as through links on the CFC's website. I'll also include a link in the chat box at the end of my talk, and I think Eli is going to throw it in there right now as well. Now, before I dive into Gordy and Isabel's stories, I want to recognize that the Clare Forestry Center sits on Fond du Lac land. These stories I'm presenting here today do not reflect the voices of the Fond du Lac community. Their perspective is incredibly important, and I want to encourage you all to explore more about the Fond du Lac directly from their community. I'll be including links to great Fond du Lac resources at the end of my talk as well. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Gordy Gullion, a wildlife biologist known today as the foremost authority on ruffed grouse. Gordy joined the Clare Forestry Center in 1959 and spent the next 32 years studying ruffed grouse, eccentric birds known for drumming on chosen logs and burrow roosting in the snow. Part of Gordy's story that surprised me was that his contributions weren't solely tied to the ruffed grouse. Gordy discovered key links between ruffed grouse and aspen regeneration, but in addition to this research, his methods were also important. When Gordy joined the CFC in 1959, one of his first projects was heading University of Minnesota Professor Bill Marshall's pioneering radio tagging program, the Grouse Dare Project. These were the earliest days of radio tagging wildlife. Radio transmitters were a recent invention, Cold War technology that had been created for missiles, satellites, and military aircraft. The Grouse Dare Project had its ups and downs, but according to Etienne Samuel Benson in the Wild Wilderness, this project eventually helped wildlife biologists achieve what was arguably their primary goal: a privileged and exclusive relationship to wild animals. Gordy was known for his meticulous, detailed research. In 2017, the Gordy Gullion Data Recovery Project was initiated by Frank Svoboda, who spent 10 years studying grouse with Gordy, and Kent Montgomery, a natural resources faculty member at Central Lakes College. The project's aim is to digitize Gordy's 70-some thousand data cards, preserving these careful records while making them accessible to researchers studying grouse today. Here, you can see one of Gordy's banding cards. The hole punches around the sides were actually part of his sorting system. By inserting a spindle in certain places, he could collect all the cards that shared an attribute, say all male grouse. According to Kent Montgomery, Gordy was going out there and collecting all of this information at a time when we didn't have computers to sort through all of this. It was an incredible amount of work to collect that material, to sort through it and come up with these discoveries. That force of character of researchers and managers like Gordy was the real takeaway for me. Gordy's collaboration with hunters was another important part of his research. Gordy enlisted hunters in Minnesota as well as other states, asking them to serve as citizen scientists by reporting information back to him on survey cards and even sending him grouse wings and tails. At the CFC, you can still find a box which contains wings, tails, feet, and all sorts of feathers. What I've spoken about are just parts of Gordy's story, which I explore more fully in his dedicated story map. I encourage you to continue learning about him and other parts of the CFC's history on the story map collection. Now, before I move on to talk about Isabel, I want to briefly touch on the audio component of Gordy's story map. I interviewed over 40 people for this entire project, including foresters, land managers, professors, students, and Cloquet area community members. And I found including clips of these conversations to be a valuable part of preserving these voices and stories. I love getting to hear these folks talking in their own words, and I hope that readers do as well. So now I'm going to share a story told to me by Frank Swoboda, who worked with Gordy for 10 years. I asked Frank if he'd ever had any unusual encounters with grouse, and this is what he told me.
I personally had an experience with another bird where I was doing some winter bud counts for these aspen plots. I was doing one of those not far from the research station headquarters, and so I'm there, and it's right off of that county road. I am walking from one tree to the next and looking up and counting the buds, and all of a sudden I noticed this grouse coming toward me, and I thought, well, I'm pretty quiet, not moving much, so maybe it didn't see me there. So I stood still for quite a while, and it just stayed, I don't know, 15, 20 feet away, and I thought, well, I really have to get back to work. So I thought, well, once I start moving, it's going to fly away. So anyway, I finished what remaining trees I had left to count, and the bird just kind of walked off a little bit, but stayed not too far away. Started walking back to the truck, and I looked behind me, the bird's following me. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. But I thought, well, maybe it just decided that it was going to go the same way I'm going. So I get in the truck, and I start driving toward the research center, and I look alongside the road, and the bird's running alongside the road in the forest, but running alongside the road. He's following the truck. Still thought, well, maybe he's deciding he's going to go the same way I'm going. So like inquisitive researcher, I thought, I'll stop and I'll turn around and see what happens. Stop, turn the truck around, went the other way. The bird decided it was going to go the same way I'm going. So, there are those rare occasions where birds, some of them do have a real affinity and a different personality.
You can hear more from Frank and others in the complete collection.
I personally have.
So now I'm going to leave Gordy's story and turn to talk about Isabel Ahlgren, a research scientist at the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center, the sister research and outreach center to the Cloquet Forestry Center. Isabel first worked at the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center in 1953. The center had just been established by Frank Hubachek at his 28-building lodge in the Boundary Waters and was known then as the Quetico Superior Research Center. Isabel ended up at the center because she was told by the University of Minnesota's College of Forestry that no summer coursework was open to women. When Isabel was told this, she already had a doctorate in botany and was teaching at Wellesley College during the school year. Thankfully, someone at the university pointed Isabel to Frank Hubachek, which is how she ended up conducting research at the center at Hub's place. Here, she met Cliff Ahlgren, the forester in charge of the center, who would eventually become her research partner and husband. Although Isabel only intended to work at the center that summer, she ended up returning, dedicating over 30 years of her life to studying the Boundary Waters. Isabel and Cliff were a formidable, tireless team. Together, the Ahlgrens collected about 6,000 plant specimens from the Border Lakes region, which are currently being integrated into the Olga Lackala Herbarium at UMD. As a botanist, Isabel was especially passionate about this project, with nearly 20% of the bryophytes in the Olga Lackala Herbarium coming from the Ahlgrens. Because of scientists like Isabel and Cliff, we have a sense of the wide range of plants found in Minnesota. Their work observing, collecting, and preserving specimens helped form an important baseline for understanding many of these ecosystems. According to Carrie Pike, former CFC director, Isabel and Cliff made observations of native trees, when they leafed out, when they'd bud break, things like that, over a 5-year period in the 50s in Ely. That kind of data is really important for climate scientists, trying to track how the earth is changing, how forests are changing from climate change. They were way ahead of their time. Isabel and Cliff also helped establish the moose fence planting of the Sawville Trail, the largest eastern white pine disease test garden in the world. At Moose Fence, the Algrens wanted to investigate whether eastern white pine could develop major gene resistance to blister rust. They began collecting cones from disease-free white pines, which they encountered in the boundary waters and along the north shore of Lake Superior. Eventually, over 43,000 eastern white pine saplings were planted at Moose Fence. The Moose Fence planting was ambitious. Ultimately, the Algrens weren't able to identify major gene resistance to blister rust in eastern white pine. However, certain trees known as slow rusters have been identified in the planting. These slow rusters seem to show increased levels of resistance to blister rust, some of them surviving for 35 years despite being infected. Cones from these trees have been sent to the Forest Service Oconto River Seed Orchard, as well as others, where researchers have continued to study them in pursuit of increasingly blister rust resistant white pines. There's value in longevity in studies like this one that span years. The Moose Fence planting didn't deliver a rust-proof white pine to Isabel and Cliff, but it did move these studies forward, providing us with an understanding of slow rusters, as well as with viable seeds for future rust-resistant forests. There's a lot more to Isabel's story, which I encourage you to explore on her dedicated story map. But now I want to turn to talking about the historical images that are part of this piece. Besides housing the research center, Hubb's place in the boundary waters was brimming with other activity. In the early years, Frank Hubachek had a logging crew of dock boys, cabin girls, visiting scientists, and guests from all over the country. I was able to meet with Sherry Dokat and Leroy Mackey up at the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center. Sherry and Leroy shared their personal photos from their time at Hubb's. Sherry worked there as a cabin girl in the mid-1960s, and Leroy worked as a dock boy in the early 1970s. Adding their photos to this story map felt like an important part of preserving the history of the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center, to which Isabel and so many others dedicated years of work and care. In telling Isabel's story, I hope that I'm also helping to preserve this past. Both Gordy and Isabel were researchers and storytellers. Gordy wrote popular articles about grouse for the Minnesota Conservation Volunteer because he understood the importance of reaching everyday Minnesotans. Isabel was the written voice for her and Cliff's work over the years, publishing books and articles. At the end of her life, she sat down with Cliff to write her recollections, a detailed, heartfelt, and often quite funny look at their time working in the boundary waters, and a fantastic historical record of the early days of the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center. Gordy and Isabel were researchers and storytellers. Like them, I believe in the power of telling stories. With the realities of climate change before us, I believe that now more than ever, it's important to connect the people who study and manage our lands and natural resources with a broader group of Americans. Through engaging stories, we are able to educate on nuanced concepts, explore new ideas, shape opinions, and garner public support. Through compelling stories, we change how our readers see the world.
2 minutes, Claire.
So now I'm going to talk briefly about 3 simple techniques that help me shape a compelling narrative from expansive, complex, and research-heavy material. I hope this storytelling toolbox can be helpful whenever you think about sharing your own research stories with a broader audience. So first, I work to orient myself in the narrative by asking, what are the stakes? Why does this story or research matter? Why do I care? Why should readers care? Being able to respond clearly and simply to these questions allows me to engage my readers, pulling them along for the ride. Another simple tool I often use is grounding my readers in the physical place I'm talking about. Allowing readers to stand in your shoes as you do your research, to feel the sun, swat the flies, look at the trees, can really draw them into your story. You can think of this as showing versus telling. By relying on sensory descriptions, sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, you can anchor your reader in a particular place. Ask yourself, what do I see as a forester or land manager or researcher that the average person would not? How can I describe this to them? If you got them, photos, audio, and video can also help you do this. My last tool is pretty self-evident. I work to try and make the technical digestible to a general audience. I wish there was an easy formula for doing this, but if there is, I haven't found it yet. Something I do try to keep in mind when I'm trying to explain a complex topic is that less is often more, as hard as that may be when you have a lot of knowledge in an area. I often focus on delivering only necessary information in exactly the moment when the reader will need it. I hope these storytelling tools can be useful to you in your research. Thank you for your time, and I invite you to explore more about these stories and other historical CFC stories in the new collection. In just a second, I'll be sharing a link to that collection as well as to some great Fond du Lac resources. Thank you.